If the police observe through plain view a bag of cocaine only after they detain a defendant illegally, are those drugs subject to suppression? To find out, you have to read People versus Messano, but it's 24 pages. Don't have time for that? I've got you covered. This is TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, where I cover New York Court of Appeals cases, and I try to do it in 5 minutes or less. This is the episode on the case of People versus Messano. The citation for this case is 2024 New York Slip Opinion 00097, published by the New York Court of Appeals on January 11th of 2024. The issue in this case is whether the police had reasonable suspicion to stop and detain the defendant and thereafter to observe drugs that they recovered along with a handgun. It's a DeBoer analysis is what we call this in criminal law. And the background I think is helpful to understand this case is basically the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. And there's something called a Terry stop, which says that the police are allowed to conduct a brief detention based upon reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. But they're not allowed to arrest the defendant based upon that reasonable suspicion. They need probable cause to arrest a defendant. There's also something called the plain view exception to the warrant requirement. So normally you can't search or seize without a warrant. In fact, searches and seizures absent a warrant are per se unreasonable, but there are a variety of exceptions, one of them being plain view, which basically means that if the police see something where they have a lawful right to be, then they can seize it if it's recognized as being contraband. That's the background that I think is helpful to understand this. The facts of this case are basically a street encounter in Syracuse, New York. During the suppression hearing of this trial, Detective Brian Hart, this is a trial for drug possession and possession of a handgun. Detective Brian Hart testified he was patrolling through Syracuse neighborhood at around 6:40 p.m. and he observed a car driving a little faster than other cars. It went past the double yellow line. He then the driver had a conversation with somebody else in another car. Those two cars pulled into a parking lot. The detective watched all this happen. And basically what happened is, they pulled into a parking lot, the driver gets out of the car, has a conversation, with the other driver in and out of their window. Then a third car comes and the officer recognizes that third driver as a person who he knows is being involved in drug-related offenses, previously arrested for drug-related offenses. So at that point, the detective thinks there's a drug transaction going on, calls other backup detectives or officers to arrive. And at that point, once all the officers arrive, an officer named Young walks up to the defendant's car. The defendant gets out of his car and starts walking towards the detective. The detective says, stop. He briefly detains him in the back of the car, doesn't find anything, frisks him for weapons, doesn't find anything, tells his partner to watch him while the officer then goes to the driver's seat or goes outside of the car and looks into the driver's compartment and sees what he recognizes to be cocaine, a bag of cocaine. He then arrests the defendant, finds a loaded handgun in the car, and when he searches the defendant, finds $1,200. The defendant's arrested, processed. The judge at the suppression hearing does not suppress the evidence, and it goes to the Court of Appeals here. There was a divided appellate division panel that affirmed the search. Goes to the Court of Appeals, and they reverse. They say this was a bad detention. Why? Because it can't be a detention, a Terry stop, a detention based upon reasonable cause to believe that crime is afoot, cannot be based on innocuous evidence or behavior that's equally susceptible to innocent explanation as criminal explanation. And that's what we have here. Nothing that the defendant did provided reasonable cause to believe that a crime was afoot. The fact that he was driving a little faster is not a crime. The fact he pulled into a parking lot is not a crime. The hand-to-hand transactions where nothing was seen passing back and forth is not a crime. And even the person that arrived that the officer knows to be involved in drug-related offenses is not a crime. And they specifically say guilt by association is not allowed in our jurisprudence. Nothing he did rises to the level of reasonable suspicion. So the detention, the Terry stop, was not proper, was not justified. And it's because the Terry stop was not justified when they held the defendant at the back of the car and the officer then goes and sees the cocaine where it would have been hidden if the defendant was back in the car. That's going to be suppressed. Why? because it was only in plain view because the defendant was being detained in the back of the car. So it can't be, the plain view can only be allowed if the officer has a legal right to be where he is, and an illegality did not precede that plain view observation. And here we have an illegality preceding the observation because the defendant was unlawfully detained under a Terry stop when he shouldn't have been. And that's the case of People versus Messano. Evidence suppressed, case dismissed. Or evidence suppressed. I don't know exactly if the case was dismissed, but they suppressed the evidence, reversed the conviction. If you like what you just saw and want to see more just like it, please hit like or subscribe to let me know.